Hello, everybody. It's Jake Sanzano, host of the Jake and Gino podcast, here with my co-host, the multifamily mentor, the coach, the chef, the father of six, the best-selling author, the G Daddy, Gino Barber. Gino, how's it going?
Jake, I'm doing good today. I hope you like the collar. You said we need an adult on the show. I think Dr. Hardy qualifies as another adult, so at least we've got two adults on the call today. How you doing, brother?
Hey, man, always making it happen. It's better than none. So today's guest is an organizational psychologist and the world's leading expert on the application of the future self science. He is also the author of numerous books, including The Gap and the Gain and Who, Not How. So without further ado, Dr. Benjamin Hardy, welcome to the show.
Happy to be with you guys.
Hey, it is our pleasure. If you don't mind kicking it off, just please explain or give us the definition of future self science.
Well, future self-science is pretty massive. The field of psychology is kind of going through like a revolution where for literally over 100 years, the primary focus was a person's past. Like if you look at like the research, like beliefs and theories of like Freud, for example, he believed that who a person was fundamentally based on their childhood experiences. But the revolution, I guess you could say over the last 10, 15, 20 years is research in neuroscience showing that the brain is actually a prediction machine towards the future, and also positive psychology, really looking at the view you have of your own future self, and that whatever view you have of your future self, and really the future you're most committed to, is the thing driving your life right now. So there's just a massive growing body of research on this subject. I've been studying it like crazy and making it useful and applicable to specific people.
So, Dr. Hardy, I'm a life coach. I'm not a psychologist. I think part of the problem with psychologists, and we've coached people, is they like to stay in the past. You know, psychologists get paid by the hour. So if I'm not fixing anybody, but they're coming back and talking about their problems for the next 10 years, what happened to their childhood, you're not really solving any problem. And I'm not talking about people who have real psychosis, but Gino, who's stuck, whose mom told him that he couldn't be anything, that don't get into multifamily. And I'm living back there and I go to the psychologist and I keep talking about it. And I see Jake smirking because that's exactly what happened to me.
Well, because you're always trying to get me to talk about things like this. I'm like, I don't want to talk about the past. Let's move forward, man. Let's go.
Because it's emotions. You got to get into your own emotions, Jake. We got to discuss it. I mean, I'm going to get a little vulnerable on the show because to me, the gap in the gain was crucial. When I read that book, I felt like, okay, I'm always living in the gap. I always want more. I'm always looking for more. And that's great. You want to be that way. You want to be forward thinking, but you have to actually be happy with where you are right now. You are where you need to be right now in order to where you need to go. And I think most people don't understand that. And they don't think about it. But getting back to what you're talking about, a person's past is important, but don't people dwell in the past too much? And if you're looking in the rearview mirror and you don't look towards the future, aren't you basically stuck? And that's what it seems like psychology and a lot of people are professing nowadays.
Yeah, a lot of things, mixture of concepts in there that you start throwing together. But I will say, yes, I would say for a really long time, psychology, and I would even say, honestly, I'm with you on this, that psychology as a discipline is mostly focused on describing problems, not solving them. And so that's what we're talking about here is that, yeah, if you're just sitting and chalking up the past, you may get to the point where you can really describe or identify a problem, but there's no real usefulness to solving it.
That's great. I love the way you put that. Much more eloquent than the way I put it. I remember listening to Tony Robbins when he first started out. He was going to these seminars. He was helping people out, but he didn't have the degree, but he was creating solutions and they thought he was a fraud. So that's what I was thinking about. Like, let me find out what the solution is. And that's why The Gap and the Gain, everybody, is such a crucial book. You all need to read this book because I want Dr. Hardy to define what the gap and the gain is. And as he's defining it, have an open mind and say, where am I right now? Right now on this show, I'm on the gain because I've read a ton of Dr. Hardy's books. I'm excited. I'm energized. I love to learn. I'm in the gain. Where are you right now as Dr. Hardy's defining the gap and the gain?
Yeah, I'll explain it. I will say that last week I was so deep in the gap myself. I was in such a dark place. I even had some of my really good friends be like, Ben, dude, you are so in the gap. So it happens to everyone, even the person who wrote the dang book. And when you're in the gap, life becomes very overwhelming. So I'll explain to you the fundamental differences, but there's a lot of depth we could probably go into. But at the basic level, being in the gap and being in the gain is how you're defining and measuring your own situation and your experience. So if you're in the gap, what you're doing is you're measuring yourself against where you think you should be. You're defining yourself against an ideal that you have for yourself. And so you're also measuring, you could also be measuring someone else in the gap. So for example, we've already talked about, we have kids, right? And so like my son Caleb is a tennis player, avid tennis player. And like I can always look at the gap and always look at where he's being bad in his tennis, or if he's in a tournament, I can point out everything he's doing wrong. And I've got these ideals for him. And so I'm like, why aren't you here yet? And so you can go in the gap about anything. You can also go in the gap about your entire past, where you believe that your past could have and should have gone a certain way, a different way than it did. And as a result, your life is now not as good as it could have been. Me as an example, I grew up in a family where, you know, my parents got divorced when I was 11. My dad became an extreme drug addict. I could look back and be like, you know, and even my wife before she was married to me, she was in a heavily abusive marriage, and she had to leave that marriage because it was so destructive. And so trauma is actually what occurs when you believe that your past should have gone a different way. And what that really means is just you're analyzing it in an ineffective way. You're comparing it with what you thought it ideally should have been. And so we can go into more and more of that, but the gain is a totally different way of looking at things. The gain is where you're only measuring yourself as a human and also measuring other people if you want to, but you can let them measure themselves. But when you're in the gain, you're really just looking at yourself backwards. Me, Benjamin Hardy, I'm only comparing myself to where I was yesterday or last week or last year. And I'm just looking at all the ways in which I'm growing and changing. I'm not comparing myself to anyone else. I'm not even measuring myself against my ideals. And as you said, it's good to have ideals. It's good to have a vision. It's good to be growing. How we talk about it in the book is that your ideals are like a horizon in the desert. The horizon is always out there providing direction and illumination, but it doesn't matter how many steps you take towards that horizon, you're never going to reach it. It's always moving with you. And so high achievers go in the gap because they're measuring themselves against where they want to be, but that horizon keeps moving, and so they'll always feel like losers unless they can get into the gain.
Mm-hmm. So the gap is internal, the gain is external, correct? And we need to
The
stop
opposite. The gap is external.
The gap
whereas
is
the
external.
gain is internal.
Okay. Gap is external, gain is, and then we need to stop comparing, and we need to start practicing gratitude as well. Correct. I mean, gratitude plays a huge component when you're in the gain. You're saying the horizon's there. I've gotten to 1,000 units. Me and Jake, we've crushed 1,000 units, but we want to get to 5,000. Thankfully, we're at now 1,500. So at least living in the gain and practicing gratitude will help you stay in the gain, don't you think?
Yeah. I mean, the gain is where you're just playing your own game. You're no longer
Mhm.
playing other people's games. You're measuring your own progress. Because, for example, if I try to play a game with you, where I'm now competing with you, I could now feel like a loser because I don't have 1,500 units. I got like 3 units. But then I could be like, well, I'm better than you because I got 5 books, right? And so this becomes some really awkward thing where you're trying to be better than other people when it's like, no, you have your own standards, I have my own standards, I get to choose my standards, yours may be in massive in real estate, that may not be where I'm really trying to grow. And so being in the gain as a practice, it allows you to have what we talk about in the book as an internal referencing system, where you have internal reference points. And we live in a world where we're actually trained to measure ourselves externally. As an example, like the education system, you know, I'm taking tests and my grades are pitted against your grade. I get to know if you got the B, I got the A. And then social media trains us to like always be comparing ourselves with other people. And so this is a practice where eventually you get to the point where you're only playing your own game and you start measuring yourself against your own progress. You start setting your own standards for yourself, deciding your own growth that you want, and it has nothing to do with anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes a lot more of a healthy approach to life. And also, certainly gratitude plays a big part in it.
Would you mind sharing the story of Dan Jansen in the book? Because I thought that was such an awesome story. He had such high expectations, never really fulfilled them. And then towards the end, I think that will really give a nice little conclusion to making people understand what the gap in the gain really looks like, even to high level performers.
Yeah, and I will say we wrote this book for high-level performers, honestly, because they're the ones who go in the gap the hardest on themselves. Because they've got such high expectations for themselves, it literally doesn't matter how much they've achieved, they still feel like losers, that they still feel like they're not doing enough. And I fall into this all the time. It doesn't matter how much, even literally hearing about someone with 1,500 units, that person could still feel like a loser because they're comparing themselves to the person with 5,000. It's like, you realize how few people have 1,500 units, but also like your past self, when you were first starting, your former self could have never imagined having even 100 units, let alone 500. And so
Very true.
The story of Dan Jansen. So Dan Jansen, and I'll forget on the years because honestly, I'm 2 or 3 books removed from writing The Gap and the Gain. But he was he was a speed skater. I think it was in the 80s, late 80s and 90s, if I remember correctly on the time frame.
Mm-hmm.
But the main point here with Dan Jansen was he was one of those people that even at a young age, everyone knew he was the best skater out there. He was so good, so talented, but he just was in a lot of ways unlucky. Like he would slip out. He just never won any like Olympic golds, even at like 15 and then 19, whatever. Like he went to the Olympics many, many times, and everyone expected him to win his respective events, because within the sport, and even like the commentators, they knew he was like technically the best, but he just kept making mistakes. And so anyways, he started working with a coach like near the end of his time. I think he was going into his final Olympics. And ultimately he started thinking about, rather than like the fact that he thought he needed to win that Olympic gold medal. And this is actually a big aspect of the gap in the gain. One of the big aspects of the gap is that you actually think you need something to be someone. And so you may think you need 1,000 units in order to be successful. Dan Jansen, I believe, was in the gap for most of his life, where he believed he actually needed that gold medal in order to be successful. But what happened, and by the way, if you feel like you need anything externally, then you're in the gap. And what that is it's an unhealthy attachment, which is never satisfied by acquiring more. Even if you get the thing you thought you needed, you'll just then give that need to something else, and it'll be psychologists call it the hedonic treadmill. It's essentially a treadmill to nowhere. Certainly the opposite of happiness. But what Jansen did was he decided to shift his mentality going into his final Olympics. And he was even competing in an event that was different than the one he was the best at. I think he was the best at like the 400 meter, but he was going into the 800 meter, from the story's coming back to me. But rather than thinking he needed that gold medal to be successful, what he did was he shifted his attention backwards. In other words, he started really thinking about everything he was grateful for. He thought about all of his coaches, his incredible career, the fact that he even had legs and he could skate. Like, he just started really thinking about all the details, all the events, all the experiences. He started to become incredibly grateful even for skating and all the transformational experiences it had given him, that he could travel the world, that he'd been through like 4 or 5 Olympics. He was just totally in the gain, I guess you could call it. He was in the gain about his life, and he just decided to make his final Olympic event an expression of gratitude and thanks for everyone, all the people watching, all the coaches he had, his parents, all the experience, just everything. He just decided, I'm just going to make this an expression of gratitude. And so he skated his last event in the gain rather than the gap. And it was, actually, I've heard it said that with this particular event, like it had like a special spirit to it, because while he was skating, he was beaming like this massive smile. Like it was different, and there was a different energy to it. And anyways, in the end, he ended up breaking world records, winning the gold. And the great part was it was great that he won, but the greater aspect was that he didn't need to win. He actually already had seen himself as successful before. He didn't need that gold medal anymore. Sure, getting it was awesome. There's nothing wrong with getting it. But the better victory, honestly, was that he shifted to the gain and realized he was already successful, like where he is now.
Do you have
Sounds
an
like he
answer?
chilled out a little bit.
Yeah. Do you have an answer as to why he did that, or how he came to that conclusion? I mean, like, that's a pretty big revelation.
There's actually, this is kind of a funny thing to point someone to. I think it's Jim Lair is a performance coach. Jim Lair wrote, I believe he wrote the book. You might know some books by Jim Lair. He's a performance coach. I think he wrote The Power of Full Engagement. He's spoken about it. Jim Lair was his performance coach. And I remember hearing about it on a podcast that Jim Lair did. I actually think it was a podcast he did with Tim Ferriss. And this is when I first actually heard the story, honestly, was Jim Lair was walking through the whole experience of helping Jansen shift from basically needing that thing to ultimately being grateful. And as I break down in The Gap and the Gain, like this, there's a whole mountain of research at this point in psychology that backs up that positive emotions are actually what lead to high performance, whereas people think that high performance is what ultimately makes you happy. It's the opposite. You got to be happy first. You've got to, even gratitude as an example, like there's a lot of research that says if you're in a negative emotional state, you end up creating tunnel vision and not thinking clearly. Like if you're trying to solve a problem in a frustrated state, you're not going to be able to think laterally or ultimately solve the problem. But if you can get into a positive state, get into a grateful state, then you can start to look at situations differently. You can make better decisions. You can be more strategic. And so positive emotions lead to much better outcomes, much higher performance. And so you ultimately want to start there first, not try to always find happiness around some future destination.
I love that. When you're in a catabolic state of energy, really low level negative energy, there's no solutions. You're either a victim or you're angry. When you can move towards that anabolic state, that invigorating, that inspiring state. And one of the ways you do it is by surrounding yourself with people who are like-minded, who give you energy, and you need to stay in that state. And that's where problems are solved. I love that. In the book, you say happiness can't come from something outside of yourself, and getting 10 years added to your life is being happy. Can you measure your health by the gap in the gain? Can you discuss that a little bit to have the listeners see how important it is to have a level of happiness or at least that feeling of fulfillment or success in your life for your health?
Like for your health specifically?
Yeah, I mean, just in general. I mean, just you were talking about being in that level of energy. You're talking about being happy. I mean, like, how does that affect your health? I mean, going forward, like with you
Yeah.
being in the gap, losing a
Okay.
week,
Yeah,
being
yeah.
stressed and all that. How does that affect you?
Yeah, so there's like this is full on chapter 3 throughout the whole book.
Yeah.
There's basically negative emotions are bad for your body. Like they're bad for your physical health. Like another way of looking at it is stress. Stress in certain manners can really amplify performance. Like if you're using stress, like short-term, acute stress, but like the constant feeling like you're not measuring up, or the constant like seeing all the problems with your kids, and just like like there's research that they did on nuns, which was one of my favorite studies, where they studied nuns, and basically what they did with these nuns, and this was like back in the 1920s, was they had them write autobiographical accounts of themselves, describing themselves. And then they followed these nuns for like years, and what they found is that the nuns that described themselves in positive and happy ways, and their life in positive and happy ways, lived literally 10 years longer than the ones that described themselves in neutral or unhealthy ways or unhappy ways. And the reason for this is that all sets of nuns in these conditions were actually in the same like monastery or whatever. They were all having the same experiences, but it's how you interpret those experiences that determines how you ultimately like you metabolize those experiences. And so if, as an example, I'm writing a book and I'm choosing to be really stressed about it, right? I'm, then that experience is in a lot of ways killing me. Or if I'm stressed out by raising my kids, because all I'm seeing is why they're not good enough, right? Like life can kill you, or it can heal you, just depending on how you ultimately contextualize it and how you interpret it. And so being in the gain about life is kind of a renewing, life-giving way of viewing your experiences, even trauma. My parent talking about, maybe your business fails, or maybe something doesn't work. I'll give an example. Every time, and this is again why it was written for high achievers, every time I try to do something big, I remember when I wrote my first book, I really wanted it to be a New York Times bestseller, and it didn't end up doing that. And so for months, I was in a depression because I felt like a failure. What I was not appreciating was I just published my first major book. I had a major publisher, got a 6-figure book deal. Like I was living my dream, and yet I was depressed because I was measuring myself against an external indicator versus against my past self, which was so far. I was living my dreams of my former self. And so, when you're in the gap, you're actually devaluing your past. And that's what I did. I devalued all of my growth of becoming a professional author, writing a book, launching the book, selling tens of thousands. I devalued all of that because it didn't reach some ideal or some external standard. And we can do that about our whole past. We can do that about our whole life. And it's certainly very draining. It's draining on us, and it's draining on those around us who have to deal with the gap that we keep projecting.
Before we go to the personal growth, I want to hold this up for everybody. The Gap and the Gain, it's an amazing book. I mean, Dr. Hardy's a prolific author. I think he's got 10 books. I started out with this one, everybody. Willpower Doesn't Work. I mean, I've got 3 on my desk
That's
right
the book
now.
I'm talking about, by the way, that I wrote that I felt like a loser on for quite a while because
Well,
it
this
didn't hit
loser
some
bought it,
stupid
so I must be a loser too because I
No,
didn't buy a
I'm the
best-selling book.
loser.
But
I'm just kidding. No, but that was just the gap. That was the gap.
uh-huh. But it's a great book. It got me to introduce me to Dr. Benjamin Hardy's world, which is pretty freaking amazing. And then this book, The Who Not How, this is another one for the Jake and Gino community. This book, I mean, working with Dan Sullivan, this was an awesome book. We wrote the book called The Honeybee, and one of this is in there, Who Not How. Can you just dive in this real quick? Just give people an idea what this is, because I want everyone to run out, buy Willpower Doesn't Work first, then Who Not How, and then ultimately let's do Gap and a Gain as the third book. And then obviously his fourth book that just came out is truly revolutionary. I think it's amazing the content he's talking about, but I love this book. We don't jump into this before we get into the short answers.
Yeah, of course, dude. Who Not How. So this is a really beautiful idea. Another Dan Sullivan. So Gap and the Gain, by the way, was a book that I co-authored with Dan Sullivan. Dan Sullivan is the co-founder of Strategic Coach. Dan is someone who's been coaching high-level entrepreneurs for literally almost 50 years now.
Mm-hmm.
He's like 78, 79 years old. I started learning from Dan back in 2014, during the fall of 2014, which was during the first year of my PhD program. And I actually admittedly was not necessarily thinking about becoming an entrepreneur. I was open to it. I was beginning to think about it, but I wasn't really sure. I was actually doing research on the difference between wannabe entrepreneurs and real entrepreneurs in my research. But my Aunt Jane started sending me little quote books from Dan Sullivan because she was an entrepreneur, and I was just falling in love with his ideas, and ultimately ended up becoming good friends with him. And I was at an event where he was teaching this concept of who, not how. And after I heard it, I was so blown away. I told him, and this was actually after I'd already written Willpower Doesn't Work. And I told him, look, if you ever want this to be a major book, I would love to write it with and for you. And that's what ultimately started our collaboration. So just to kind of explain what who, not how is, it's a much better approach for entrepreneurs, but it's a concept that anyone can use. And basically the idea is that usually when someone is trying to solve a problem, they ask themselves, how do I do this? And by asking how, you've now placed the burden of doing it upon yourself. Whereas a much better approach is who would be better qualified to do this than me, or who could do this for me, or who can help me do this. So for example, if I'm wanting to get onto a podcast, I could ask, who could get me on it? Or I could ask, how do I get on a podcast? Much better question is, who could get me on a podcast? So who is just a much faster way to solve problems. Who helps you, who first off turns you into a leader, because now you just have a vision and you give that vision to other people and you let other people do it. You're not worried about the how. That's actually a big aspect of transformational leadership, is that you clarify the what and the why, the vision, why it's so important. You get really specific about what is success. You've got clear criteria, but you do not have any involvement in the how. You let other people who want to do it, who are more capable of doing it than you, do the how. And mine and Dan's collaboration is an example of that. He doesn't write these books. Like, that's my skill set. He doesn't tell me how to write it. He doesn't even tell me which books to write. It was my choice to write Who Not How, my choice to write Gap and Gain, my choice to write the one I'm writing right now. Like, I'm the who, I choose what I do. So it's just a really beautiful way of living in it. And it allows you to stay focused on what you want to do. Like, it allows you to stay in your zone of genius where you just focus on what you want to do and you get much better at letting other people do the rest.
Jake, before you go to the personal growth, one last question about values. How do values come into play as far as, with the Gap and the Gain and who and how? Because we talk about values-based decision-making. We talk about long-termism. We have the 100-year mindset. How do values come into play with the Gap and the Gain and who, not how?
I think values are great. Values, to me, value is, what do you value? Like, what matters to you? What do you stand for? What do you believe in? So I actually prefer the use of the term standard over value, because value is ephemeral. Value is unclear, whereas a standard is something that like if you make something a standard, then it's clear cut. And so what I like about either values or standards are that I don't have to worry about what your standards are. I just have to worry about my own. Like, I have my own standards, and I don't need to judge you based on your standard. Your standard may be that you have 5,000 units, and that's the standard you're growing yourself into. I don't need to compare myself with your standards. I don't need to judge you. You can have your standards. Dan actually has a beautiful concept on this. He calls it wanting what you want. And he says, rather than thinking you need something, you should just have what you want. And when you want what you want, you allow other people to want what they want and what they value. And so I think what's massively important with all of this is that a person ultimately gets clear on their own standards for themselves, and that they go as far as they want into those. And actually being in the game about your life helps you clarify your standards for yourself. Like when I can clarify by looking at my experiences where certain things didn't work, like where it didn't go according to plan, or where it could have gotten better. And so I can use my experiences to better define success for myself. But it is for myself. It has nothing to do with you, or has nothing to do with your opinion of what I'm going for.
Thank you.
The interesting thing about the who, not how concept is that the story of our entrepreneurial journey is, how do I screw this up and get it far enough that I can hand it off to someone else before the whole thing implodes? I think that's the funniest thing about it, because we started bookkeeping. Okay. We even started lawn care internally when we started our property management, and we did it all enough to get it to a point where we're like, oh my God, this is going to implode until I get a professional to do this. So we jokingly called it the I'm a mentality. I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that, I'm gonna do everything. And that was looking back after we started all these things, did it well enough so that it was in existence, but it was terrible. We had to get the hell out of the day-to-day of it. So it's very appropriate. But
Love that.
Yeah, I
all
would
right.
say I'm writing the third book in the series. It's called 10x is easier than 2x. And one of the big kind of concepts in the book is that if you go for 10x in whatever it is, then you're forced to massively simplify who you are and what you do. Like you can only do one or two things like very, very well, and you have to actually get 10 times better before you can go 10 times bigger. But in order to go 10 times better, you have to massively simplify almost everything down to what is the core essential. We use the 80-20 concept as kind of an idea that if you want to go 10x, 80% of what you're now doing is a distraction. 80% of what you're now doing is actually irrelevant. And so those are a lot of those hows probably that you're doing, right? That maybe have got you here, but won't get you there. And so you have to be really honest if you're going to play a bigger, more transformational game, that you've got to go even simpler, do even less, but do those few things 10 times better, because you got to get so good at what you do that your work becomes 10x level. But in order to do that, you can't do very much. And every time you do go 10x, you become increasingly simple. It's like peeling away the layers of the onion. You go deeper and deeper into a concept that Dan calls unique ability, where you just get better and better at the core element of who you are. And you do less and less. You've got more and more teamwork around you. Your attention isn't so scattered on 50 different things, but you're in flow. Time slows down. You're doing very few things, but you're going very deep into those few things.
I think the biggest challenge with that for most people is they either refuse to hire enough and employ enough quality control to ensure that they can do that without the whack-a-mole syndrome that comes up because fires start flying all around them. So I think the key for that, especially when you have a lot of employees, is that obviously you need to hire well, have a good package in place for them, but ensure that there's enough quality control and enough team members around where you're not having to get pulled back into it, if you want. I think that's where so many people struggle, and that's that kind of hurdle from getting to where you are to that next level where you can actually, it's to your point, be in that flow state, because you're not, being the entrepreneur that has to insert themselves all the time. I think there's a lot of people that go through that.
I think it's a growth process. This is why you got to be in the game.
Yeah.
We actually wrote the gap in the game before 10x for this very reason, that if 10x becomes a painful, terrible lifestyle if you're in the gap. But if you're in the game, then you're playing your own game. You're seeing that you've already gone 10x before. You've done it multiple times. You can do it again. I also do like the EOS kind of system or approach where, they talk about having what they call an implementer, but really it's just like a CEO or a leader, but you get someone to run the company for you. Dan actually calls it create a self-managing company, where you're not the one running the company. You're the visionary leader slash creative slash collaborator with other massive people. And, you know, you're deep. You're going deep into either your thinking or into collaborations, relationships, opportunities, and someone else is actually running the operations of the business. They're the one hiring. They're the one doing all the stuff. Like, that's a massive transition that
It's another
people
I'm
who
a
want to be
Gino.
entrepreneurs, need to make.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I was the best hiring person, and it turned out it wasn't so good after all. So just a fun. All right,
It's
guys.
better to get a who to hire than not. Don't be the hirer.
No
People,
doubt.
by the way, this is
No,
that worst question that everyone asks about who, not how. They say this literally every, I get this every time. You never actually tell us how to find the who's. And I say, you're not the one to do it. You get a who to do it.
that is fantastic. All right, guys, let's take a quick time out to hear from our sponsor.
If you are looking to get involved in multifamily, this is where you need to be.
The team you've built is incredible.
There is no egos here. Everyone is always looking to help the other person.
All right, we're back. We're gonna crack the top off you here. We're gonna get into some personal things. Want to hear about you a little bit. So obviously, came out with a lot of books, highly productive. How do you stay organized and productive? Do you have a system? Maybe get into that a little bit.
Yeah, so I have an assistant that I work with who she's kind of what we would use in the EOS language. She's like the implementer. But yeah, she keeps me organized. We create standards or criteria, right, for like what I'm trying to accomplish. And then she's the one who so I mean, I have a very simple system for focusing on what matters most. I like the quote from Jim Collins that he says, if you have more than 3 priorities, you have none. So like I prefer the terms priority and standard over value, just because value, I get that I value things, but if you have more than 3 priorities, you have none. And so for me, I have 3 very clear priorities for my life. 3, I guess you could call it buckets of focus. And those are the areas that are essential to me. They're important to me. And they're also very important to my future self. And I just know that anything that's outside of those 3 like core priorities is irrelevant to me. It's also irrelevant to my life right now.
Do you mind sharing those?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, those change over time. Like my priorities right now are different than my priorities in the past. And my future self will have different priorities than I now have. So yeah, so I'll share my past priorities and I'll share my current priorities. So my past priorities, if you were to talk to me like 5 years ago, my priorities would have 5 years ago, my main priorities were to adopt our 3 foster kids, finish my PhD, and launch my first book. Those would have been my, become a professional author essentially. And those were the 3 areas of focus that were essential to my future self. And it's important to realize that the goal is what drives the process. And so we've got to be really, and that this is the whole point of the future self science, is that whatever you're most committed to is the thing driving your life. Your present is being driven by the future you're most committed to. And so it becomes important to clarify and prioritize and then strategize that future. As far as myself right now, I would say my 3 major priorities are my family, my career, but most specifically like books and finances, and then more of my like spiritual or even like my church responsibilities. Like those are the 3 areas of my life that are most essential right now, that honestly are the most exciting, the most interesting, the most transformational. Anything outside of those 3 areas is just not, I just don't have that much to contribute to it at this point right now.
So diving into that a little bit, maybe describe some of those spirituality practices or anything that is benefiting your life currently.
Well, it's more about roles. These are roles. So I have a role as like in my family as a husband and a father. I have a role in my career, mostly as an author, but as a collaborator and a leader. So like, in my church, like I have like a role as an assistant to, just like a person within the community. And so like, these are more about roles than practices. These are like the roles that I'm focused on. And they're my priorities. So, I mean, as far as spiritual practices, certainly prayer, journaling, gratitude, having a vision and trying to achieve that through faith, like those are practices that I certainly have. And I'm certainly a Christian believer in God. So I have practices, but I'm talking within these priorities. These are more the roles that I'm embodying that also are relevant to my future self, which I'm trying to grow into massively. Like one of the things I like about a 10x vision is that my current self is very temporary. My current self is like nowhere near where I will be on the other side of committing to this vision and becoming what it demands of me. So why these three roles are important to me. I value them, I care about them, but also they're very transformational. I love where they're taking my future self.
Yeah, so staying on the bucket trail here, from a personal finance side, anything that you're doing that you want to share with the listeners that's advancing your growth from the finance side?
Yes, absolutely. One thing I did, just speaking of journaling, which, this is an interesting gain practice I actually did today. What I did today was I wrote down in what ways am I and is my life different than it was 12 months ago? And so I just wrote down all the areas in which my life is different. Certainly finances, like I invest an X amount of money every week. It's actually on autopilot. It leaves my bank account and goes into my Schwab investment account literally every week. And I've been doing that for years. And I typically generally raise the prices. Actually, I raised the amount by double recently on how much is going in autopilot, literally. So like that's one thing. But even like this house that I'm in is a second house in my neighborhood, which is just purely an office. Which is great. Like that's something I've gotten in the last year, which is a qualitative change. One of the things that I think is very important and interesting is that qualitative changes are actually bigger and more profound than quantitative changes. Like if I make a qualitative change, that means that I'm doing something fundamentally different than I did before, fundamentally different and better, less but better. And that's back to the idea of 10x, is that you're doing less things but better. I apply a lot of who, not how. I've got a great financial advisor. I also, I actually, if you want like specifics, I did just get a sweet, like a HELOC on my house, just in case something falls apart in the market. Like I've got a ton of equity and I've got a good amount of cash that if I want to throw it at something, if the market goes crazy. One thing that Dan taught me, and this is different probably from like, I'm not totally like in depth with your guys' audience, but like I'll say something that helped me. So one of the things that Dan says, and this is more of a 10x is easier than 2x concept, but the main bottleneck that all human beings have is their attention span. Like our attention is our most finite resource, and most people's attention is too spread thin, being triggered or pulled by this, by that, by this, by that. And because I am a writer, someone who wants to go really deep into concepts, ideas, conversations, it's really bad for me to manage my own finances. For over a year, I got way caught up in the crypto conversations, bubble and stuff. And one thing that Dan says is he literally does not invest in things he doesn't have to think about. He doesn't want to have to think about it because he values his attention too much. His attention's worth way more than the percentage upgrades that any of his investments will make. Mm-hmm. He gets who he trusts and values to invest for him. And so that was one thing that I had to learn the hard way, because I probably wasted so much of my time watching the market or watching this. And some people, that's their unique skill. That's where they're going deep. That's where they're going to go 10x better. For me, I just had to be honest with myself. that I'm better off having who's to handle that for me so that I don't have to think about it. Because if I'm thinking about 10 or 15 different things, how you do anything is how you do everything. And usually if you're going thin on everything, what that means is you're mediocre at everything. And so I'd rather just really focus on my 3 priorities, go really deep, really big into how I can be enormously better in those few roles and have who's handle the rest.
You just made the argument as to why we're multifamily investors. Our business is our investment, and it keeps our focus and attention on the money. So that's why I love that.
That's good. That's beautiful.
Yeah, no, and it's not like a braggadocious thing. It's just a promotion of the vehicle
that's your
and why it's
standard, and
worked
that's
really
what
well
you're.
for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm
So
with you on that.
It's worked well. Yeah.
As long as you know where you want to give your attention and where you want to get enormously better and deeper and clearer. That's the main thing here is just
Well,
that you know where you want to get better.
Yeah, and it's funny that you bring that up because even in years past, you'll see different. So we go out, we literally buy apartment buildings. A lot of people go out and raise money for apartment buildings, and then so you'll see this kind of thing online. We just closed 300 units, and it's like 100 investors pouring into it. So for Gino and myself, we could be like, okay, we only added 100 or 200 units this year, and get frustrated by it because some other group, went out and raised a ton of money and did 1,000 units or something. And so in the last year, we've literally taken a step back and said, we're going to look to grow our top line revenue by 20% year over year and try to, stop, worrying about, what other people are doing, focus on our business, make sure our business is the best. We're delivering the best service for our customers. And that's it. That's why it really resonated well with me. So I think it's fantastic. Where can
and now you're playing more and more of your own game, right?
Playing
That's why
our
he
game,
lifted
man.
up the gap in the gain.
That's exactly
when
right.
you're in the gain, you stop worrying about what other people are doing outside of you, right?
Yep, we're playing. That's exactly right. We're playing our game. I think that's fantastic. Where can listeners learn more about you? Pick up the books. Where's the hub?
BenjaminHardy.com is the hub. FutureSelf.com is a different hub, but those are basically the 2 hubs.
Excellent. Gino, take us home here.
Jake, I didn't even get a chance to sing on the podcast, so
take yourself. I don't know where it's coming from today, but if you want to get in the game for a second, hit it, man.
Che bella cosa una giornata in sole, un'aria serena dopo una tempesta, bell'aria fresca, pare già una festa. Che bella cosa una giornata in sole. And that could have been in the gap because I could suck, but I don't care because I'm in the game because I feel good. It made me happy. It gave Jake a smile, and I just love to share it. And that
you're getting a little bit better.
A little bit better.
But by the way, are you Italian or do you have like Italian roots?
Just a little bit. Last name is Barbaro, so it's Italians can do 2 things. We can eat and cook, and we can sing. But as far as Jake wrapping this up, I mean, I honestly, I'm not a salesperson, but start with Willpower. I mean, he felt like a loser when he wrote it, but I mean, the loser today has got 10 books. I mean, he's just a New York Times bestseller. Who, not how. This is for all the entrepreneurs out there who are trying to grow their business, and this is for everybody. Whether you're a multifamily, whether you're in single family, whether you're a parent, whether you're struggling. The gain is where you want to be. Don't compare yourself to others. I mean, I think the goal in life is actually not to achieve the goal, to become the person that you need to become in order to achieve that goal, because you're always changing. And as Dr. Hardy was talking about his 3 buckets, he could be living in the gap all the time because 5 years from now, he's going to be a different iteration of himself. So he's thinking to himself, how am I going to get to myself 5 years from now? Well, the trick is to enjoy what you have, to look back and to see where you were 2 years ago, 1 year ago, and say, I've achieved so much in the time span, in that time span. Enjoy it, but then look towards the future and look towards what you want to become, and always have that gratitude and have happiness. Being happy is really important. We can achieve happiness just by being present and being thankful for all that we have. So I just want to thank you for being on, Dr. Hardy, and sharing the time today. I know you're really busy, bunch of books out there. Go to the website. Friggin' awesome. Loved it.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say is when I was thinking about how my life is different than it was 12 months ago. 12 months ago, The Gap and the Gain wasn't even published. Isn't that kind of funny? It came out last October. So
wow,
this conversation wouldn't have even been possible 12 months ago because you wouldn't even known about it.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's amazing how things change. But you enjoy enjoy Italy, and I hope people grab those books. Certainly, I agree that I think that The Gap and The Gain will eventually go on to sell millions of books, because I just think it's that important of a concept.
Awesome.
And Who
I
Not
agree.
How is very useful as well. So certainly, any listeners, these are just simple tools to make your life a lot easier.
Thank you.
Excellent. Guys, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.